So there's been the question, how do I access this information later on? Two ways. So some of you have seen this form out in the foyer area, and it says, let's stay in touch, or let's stay in contact. Fill one of these out so we can contact you. It has a list of other events, as same as the calendar. So if you have time in June, we have hikes, we have cooking classes, we have hydrotherapy, and many other wonderful ways to stay in contact. But with this form, this will help us know where your interests are. And if you just put a brief note that you want to know more about the recordings, we can do that as well. We are going to put it on the website, but it's not there right now. The other thing is, after the program, this final presentation, there are refreshments downstairs. So feel free to stay, eat some watermelon. I think there's some cookies. So stay, and we would love to visit with you. And the other thing is, sometimes after these presentations, there are still questions. After the 15-minute questions, you might think of something later. If you want to stay in contact and you have further questions, let me know, and I can get you some contact information to be in touch with David, or if anything else comes up. Sometimes people ask about, well, can I have him speak at this location? I know this place over here where it would be really helpful, or do you have referrals? People just have a lot of questions sometimes, so feel free to contact us. So again, on the back foyer, there's a form that says let's stay in contact. There's also some freebies back there. But let's stay in contact and the calendar. And that's it. And we'll go ahead and start with our final presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. All right. Okay, so hopefully your heads did not explode after our last one, but we were talking about intergenerational trauma and how information and even in the genes can get passed down. We can actually have, it's not just our genes that can get passed down in terms of our physical appearance, but even our stories. And so if I don't resolve something, and maybe I never figure out how it is that I get over this fact that I always feel like I'm a loser and I never quite make it in life, if I don't figure out how to answer that question gets passed off to my children. That does not mean I'm doing something bad, but it means that the questions will keep going until someone answers them. And this is why things can go down to the third and fourth generation. Now, what we're going to be talking about here are effective treatments for PTSD, really exploring some of the various therapies. So just a couple of things here. Unfortunately, some of the slides, some of the text is going to be a little bit small, so I apologize in advance for that. This is the first time putting together a whole presentation that's just on this. So there's a few bugs that'll get worked out as we go along. The second thing is I won't be able to go as much in depth on each one of these as I'd like to be able to, but I'm just going to give you kind of the bird's eye view. But as we go along, if you have questions about them, please, please, please write them down, because each one of the ones that I'm putting up here, with the exception of the written exposure therapy, are all ones that I've used before as a therapist in seeking to help people. So I'll go through each one of these, and again, if you have questions along the way, just let me know, and I'll make sure to go back and answer. So the overview on understanding PTSD will be very brief, because by this point, I think you're all pretty familiar with it. But I'm going to go through some techniques. One of them is called somatic experiencing. Another one is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's EMDR. And as I said in our previous one, some of these have some controversy behind it. I'll make sure to cover that with you. The written exposure therapy is another one. Internal family systems is another. And then dialectical behavioral therapy, and then cognitive processing therapy. Now, the gold standard for therapy in regular therapeutic settings is cognitive behavioral therapy. But when you are dealing with trauma, cognitive behavioral therapy and any other basic approach does not tend to work as well. And that's because trauma just works differently. It's not primarily a cognitive problem. It's one that involves the body and oftentimes gets deep into the attachment history, which cognitive behavioral therapy can handle, but for the most part is designed to handle things on a more short-term model. And PTSD is not a short-term treatment most of the time. All right, now this doesn't mean CBT can't help people, but there's a reason why it's not the first go-to. When you look on the VA site and the Department of Defense, it will not have that listed as like the first one that you use. Okay, so understanding emotion regulation is really important. Emotion regulation is one of the most critical aspects to this, because one of the most difficult parts of having PTSD is the constant tension and anxiety all the time. It's feeling really, really tense and on edge. It's immediately getting to the place where you're almost on the verge of tears, or you're suddenly extremely angry, like you just want to break everything around you. That tends to be the hardest part of it, is just the emotions are so large that they're almost impossible to contain. And this is oftentimes the reason why people who do have PTSD tend to kind of want to stay away from people, because they know that they can be easily triggered by even just small cues in the environment, and they know their responses are usually bigger than what's necessary, but it's almost impossible to contain. So emotion regulation is a very important piece of what is needed. So practices that help people to be more present with what's really going on are super helpful. And so when we talk about being present, one of the ways that I talk to people about this is using your senses. So like one of the ways that you can do this is if you have something in your hand that's familiar, whether it's a pair of eyeglasses or a pen, I just want you for the next 20 seconds to just take some object that you're fairly familiar with and just look at it for 20 seconds. And all I want you to do is just see what you notice about it and see if you can notice even the smallest detail that you've never paid attention to before. Okay, so we'll just do this for 20 seconds. Just pick any object. It could be something familiar, it could be a wallet, it could be keys, it could be pen, doesn't have to be anything super interesting. But for 20 seconds, see if you can look at that object and see if you can distinguish something that's different that you did not notice before. Okay. All right. Did anybody find something? You don't have to tell me what it is, but just raise your hand if you did find something that you didn't notice before. Okay. All right. Now, while you were looking for that, how did you feel in that moment?
Relaxed. Relaxed.
Relaxed?
Curious.
Curious?
Centered.
Centered? Yes. Productive? Now notice this. Just from taking an object and actually looking at it and trying to find something different, you're immediately bringing yourself in the present. Now, I'm going to tell you something really interesting about your brain. When somebody is looking at something, when your brain is processing visual information, I'm just going to break this down in percentages. Only 10% of the work that your brain is doing comes from what your brain is seeing from the outside. The other 90% of what your brain is doing after it's seen something is it's going inside and trying to figure out what that object is. So to put this in everyday terms, most of what you see has less to do with what's in front of you and more to do with what you expect, right? So your brain is constantly filling in the blanks. Now you notice with children, they get really excited about things that seem really simple. Like I remember my kids were little, they love to go like pick up sticks and throw rocks in the water. Do you all like to do that now as much as your little kids did? And the answer is probably not. And that's because you've been there, done that. Now, the problem is that what starts to happen is we fill in more of our experience with our assumptions and less of our experience with what's really happening, right? Because only 10% of what you're taking in right now is about what's really happening. The other 90% is being filled in with what you expect. And it's why we get bored easy. It's why we tune out. It's why we start to lose our concentration on things, is because we're just assuming we know what's coming next. Now, here's the wild thing. For that little 20 seconds where you were actually just trying to look at something different, there's several things that we'd be able to track in your brain. And one of them is that your brain is actually completely focused on a single thing. It's not running all over the place. It's actually present. The second thing is that people who spend more of their time focusing on what's in the present actually tend to age more slowly, be more happy, and be far more calm. They don't have days that just blow by and they don't know what just happened over like the last 6 days. It wasn't a blur to them, which is odd. You would think that if you're filling in the day with assumptions, that make your day feel longer because you have more time to get to what's really important, but it actually doesn't work that way. The more attentive you are to the immediate present, the better the quality of life tends to be. And this is one of the reasons that we do this, especially when there's PTSD, because PTSD is taking you everywhere except here. It's always in the past, always dealing with something, what could happen in the future and what did happen in the past. It's almost never present. And so by just simply bringing the attention to the present, it helps to regulate the emotions. This is why we feel more calm and more centered. Deep breathing exercises, I can go back over that at another time, but we talked about them already. This is like the 6, 7, 8 breathing in for a count of 6, holding for a count of 7, exhaling for a count of 8. When you do things like this, again, it slows down your heart rate. It helps to calm your autonomic nervous system. And all the benefits of emotional regulation are numerous. All right, so as I said, I'll be passing through some slides. The next technique I want to tell you about is what's called distance self-talk. So distance self-talk is kind of playing off what we talked about last time, because you're constantly talking to yourself in your head, right? So when you're talking to yourself in your head, there's a number of things that will happen. So let me just tell you the experiment they did. In this particular experiment, they had subjects sit down and write down the thoughts that they were having in that given moment. And they had them process through like a bad memory. Not anything super traumatic because it's an experiment. They don't want to dysregulate people too much, but something that was upsetting. In experiment 1, they wrote out their thoughts in the first person, like I did this, this happened to me, etc. In the second one, they had people write it out in the second or third person, like you did this, and this happened to you. And in the third one, they had them strictly do more of third person self-talk. David experienced this and David experienced that. Now, what was so wild was just by changing how people refer to themselves, they actually had a greater emotional regulation. In fact, the more distant the self-talk was, the greater the emotional regulation. When people speak to themselves in the first person, they tend to be more negative, and they tend to be more overgeneralized in how they describe things. Like these bad things always happen to me. But when people speak to themselves in the third person, they tend to be more coach-like. They tend to be like the way that we are when we're giving advice to a friend. And you probably noticed that we actually have great advice for other people, like really good advice. I mean, it's like, you tell me your problems, I can just, look, I got the solutions for you. I can write, man, I can have a schematic. I can what 6-month plan on how to get out of your problems. But when it comes to mine, it's impossible. It's impossible. No one understands how difficult this is for me. No one's got it as bad as I do. But the reason has everything to do, it has less to do with the situation you're in, and it has more to do with the perspective that you're taking it from. When you take on a third person perspective of your own situation, emotion regulation increases and the amount of distress you have decreases. In fact, there was a really cool experiment that they did, and they had little kids do a self-control experiment. And in the self-control experiment, the children were supposed to try to resist temptation. So the way they did this is they had these kids play this game that was extremely boring. In the game, what they were supposed to do is if it was a cat, they pushed the space bar, and if it was cheese, they didn't do anything. Now, how long do you think it took for kids who are like 6 to 10 years old to get bored with a game like that? It's almost immediate, right? But what the experimenter said is like, look, just try to stay in the game as long as you can. You're not going to get in trouble if you don't stay in there. It would just help us as experimenters if you stayed in there. But if you decide you don't want to do this, we have this really awesome game where when you push buttons, things like, don't explode, but like it's really fun. It was like a frog jumping on a lily pad and had amazing graphics and like great music and all this other stuff. And so these were their 2 choices. Now, what they did is they did something similar to what we just talked about. In one case, they were supposed to coach themselves through by referring to themselves in the first person. Like, I can do this. The experimenters are counting on me. And the second one, they referred to themselves by name. Like, David, you got this. David, the experimenters are counting on you. But then they threw in a third element. And the third element, they were to talk as though they were one of their favorite characters. Like if they like Batman or Dora the Explorer. Batman has a mission to do. Batman must be successful at this particular task. Now, guess which one of those trials had the best results?
The third.
The third one, that's right. When they imagined themselves to be an example that they looked up to, they performed better. And so people that have an exemplar, an ideal example to follow, tend to do better when they imagine themselves being in that same spot than when they take things from a first person view. So distant self-talk, amazing technique that you can start right now. They talk about the Solomon effect, how Solomon gave great advice to everybody else, but did not follow his own. Maybe Solomon, if he would have spoke to himself in the third person, like, Solomon, you need to get it together, probably would have helped out quite a bit. So you can try this experiment immediately in your life. Distant self-talk is an amazing technique that can help us to overcome some of the things that are involved with trauma, depression, other symptoms, but specifically trauma in particular, is that outside coaching voice. This also connects that part of the brain we talked about before, the DLPFC. You don't have to remember that, but that is the part of the brain that helps to talk to your emotional brain, like this thumb part here. That's one of the parts that talks to that and tells it to calm down. If you talk to yourself in the third person, you're actually activating that part of the brain, especially on the left side of your brain. That's the part that's going to be talking to your emotional system, telling it to calm down. So when you do that third person, you're way more likely to activate that part of the brain, which in PTSD is oftentimes shut down pretty badly. So really cool stuff. And the more you practice it, the better you get at it. It's one of those things your brain will wire it if it practices it enough. All right, so we're gonna kind of skip through the review of the PTSD piece just to make sure we get on to the parts that are more specific to this lecture. All right, so the next one we're gonna look at is what's called somatic experiencing. Now, how many people were here when we talked about the gentleman who couldn't move his arm because of the truck incident? Okay, so that was actually an example of somatic experiencing. So just by a quick review, this gentleman had lost some of the mobility in his arm. He couldn't extend his arm beyond a certain point. And the reason this happened was because there was a terrible accident, and he was used to seeing those because he was a first responder. But in this particular case, he only thought that the driver was the only person who was killed in the accident, but found out there was a child in the back. And he saw that as he was reaching for the keys, and he froze. And afterwards, he lost that mobility in his arm. Now, in somatic experiencing, there's a number of things that go into this, but one of the big principal techniques in somatic experiencing is helping the person to notice what is happening in their body. There's less about the talk, about the story, and there's more about what was your body trying to do. This is a question that I've asked people many times, even when they don't have trauma. So, a case in point, I was working with we'll say Sandy, and I was working with Sandy, and Sandy grew up in a home where her father was extremely abusive, very angry, would beat on the kids and on the mom, and all just horrible things happened in that home. And as she grew up, Sandy went on to have children, but then what happened is that one of the children also started to develop some abusive tendencies and hurt one of the other younger ones. And they felt extreme guilt about this. And so we worked through and talked through that. Now, the part that came back to the somatic experiences is we talked about what it is she would notice would happen in her body when she would become angry. Because most of the time what she would do is she would shut down and suppress because it felt dangerous and scary, but she didn't want to be an explosive tyrant like her dad was. So what we did is we paused for a second and said, okay, Sandy, we're in a safe space. So what I want you to do is I just want you to think about that feeling that comes up in your body when you're upset. She's like, okay, well, we'll give this a shot. And so she thought about that feeling that was in her body. I was like, okay, what do you notice? And so she would say, well, I feel this really tight burning in my chest. I feel like my muscles are really tight, like everything inside of me just wants to explode. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to take that feeling. I just want you to notice what would really happen if you let some of those things out. Now, she was scared of this because she thought this would result in the abuse of her child or something like that. And so when I asked her about that, I asked her what she noticed that her body wanted to do. And she said, as soon as she said it, as soon as I asked that question, I can see tears starting to flow from her face. And the reason that happened is because she realized her anger wasn't anything like her dad's, because the anger that she felt was something that was actually driving her to do something to protect her children, not harm them. But because she would just keep suppressing that emotion so much, it was part of the reason why some of the abuse even happened, is because she was afraid to allow that anger to exist, but that anger actually had a good motive behind it. And people start to disown those emotions and never allow them to play out what they're supposed to. That doesn't mean every impulse that we have is good and that we should just act on those every time we have them. But what it does mean is that oftentimes emotions get stuck in the body, and because we never find a way to express them, then they just keep accumulating and building and keep us stuck in the same patterns and cycles. A second way that this sometimes is released, I think this came up in our first meeting, is through like massage. Massage actually can be very powerful. Anybody who's ever done massage before, I'm sure you've had times where you're working on somebody and then you'll see these emotional releases. So maybe you've been somebody who's received a massage and then you just start tearing up and you don't know why that's happening. Mm-hmm. But the reason that's happening is because the memory is stored in your body. There are certain movements that you've not allowed yourself to make, like the man who's turning the keys. But with somatic experiencing, you can be a lot more intentional about finding out why that tension is there. There's a reason why his arm couldn't move. There's a reason why another person I talked to would freeze up whenever they had to make a big, serious decision. They would just be like deer in the headlights. They get frozen in the same places they got frozen when the trauma happened. If you can understand what that body posture was, what that position was when you kind of like gave up or like felt like you lost control, that same body position, I've even had people go into that same body position to hold that for a second, to notice what their body wants to do and allow them to actually finish off that action. There was one where a gentleman wasn't able to get to running, and the therapist was sitting in there with him, and he was saying, what do you notice is happening in your body this time when you imagine the situation? He was actually Alaskan, and he was native to Alaska, and he'd actually been chased by a wolf out there and when that happened, he froze, and his dad had to come and rescue him, and his dad was badly injured because he couldn't get himself to run. And so we went back into this moment where his legs did not work for him. But he went back into that moment, and the therapist said, okay, I want you to notice what's happening in your legs. What do you feel? And he's like, well, I feel this energy in my legs. He said, start using your legs. And so this guy's sitting in a chair, kind of like running in place in his seat. But as he began to do that, he actually let go of that trauma. And as he began to run in his seat, he no longer was running in his life. Like he actually was able to move through the memory, so the memory did not keep following. These are some of the details of somatic experiencing. Okay, so I have to skip some of these. Sorry that we have to do that. There's a couple of other strategies that can help with emotion regulation that are related to the body. One of them is cold showers. That's a pretty straightforward technique. But when you do the cold shower, one of the things that you actually want to do is see if you can regulate your breathing. See if you can actually pause that initial shock response. Because when you first hop in there, you get a huge shot of adrenaline, norepinephrine, everything starts releasing in your body, which can be really helpful if you're depressed. But the second thing you want to do after that is see if you can maintain calm while experiencing something that is everything but calming. So we just went to Dharma Lake a little bit earlier today. That wasn't as freezing cold as sometimes water can be, but I've really learned to just like try to just breathe and calm yourself through it. When you learn how to do that, if you're able to regulate yourself from that kind of immediate adrenaline rush, that carries over into other situations where you might feel an intense eruption of emotion. If you practice it, your body will know how to do it when you're back in the emergency again. All right, does this make sense to everybody so far? I know I'm doing lots of information, and there's not always time to pause and check. All right, so we talked about the 6, 7, 8 breathing, the double sigh, a focus on inhalation. If your goal is to increase your focus, you actually want to put more emphasis on your inhalation. If your goal is to calm down, you want to put more focus on your exhalation. So we talked about the exhalation one last time. That helps to calm your heart rate. For the inhalation one, you do something a little different. So with this one, like if you're having difficulty focusing and like your brain is like all over the place, here's the one that you do for inhalation. So one of the first things you do is you take in your air as fast as you can and you blow it out very quickly. And you do this a few times. Now, don't do it right now because you're going to get lightheaded. But you do this a few times. And once you've done that about like 10 or 15 times, for your last one, you breathe in really quickly, and then you let it out, and then you hold your breath for about 60 seconds. Now, you'll probably notice at that point, after you've done this, that it actually is a lot easier to hold your breath because you've just purged a whole bunch of carbon dioxide out of your system, and your blood becomes a lot more alkaline. And so when you're holding your breath, your blood is actually getting back to the place where it's supposed to be. But after you're done with an exercise like that, it tends to bring your focus back online. You tend to be more alert, like you're not like freaked out or anything like that, but you're a lot more alert and present when you do this kind of breathing. Okay, polyvagal theory. So in our first lecture, remember the little thermometer that I showed there? So you have like these levels of activation. So in your calm state, you have your ventrovagal. This is when you're in that calm place. So with the ventrovagal piece, this is the part that allows us to socialize, allows us to connect, allows us to.
The vagus nerve?
Yes, the vagus nerve. Yes. So yeah, the vagus nerve. So there's polyvagal theory. This is a particular treatment approach. This one is more of a theory than a specific approach to therapy, but it does keep the vagus nerve as the primary focus. Your vagus nerve, just for review, is the nerve that helps to connect your mind to your body. It's the part that carries and allows your emotions to be felt on a physical level. And so the more tone you have in your vagus, the more ability, your vagus nerve, the more ability you have to regulate your emotions. Okay. So the ideal state you want to be in is what's called a ventral vagal state. This is when you're calm. This is when you have the ability to socialize. You can think about and talk about deep things. You can experience joy, laughter, and those kinds of emotions. This is part of the reason why it's important to actually allow yourself to have moments where you can laugh. Now, I've noticed that whether people are depressed or anxious, it's sometimes harder to get laughing, but usually if somebody is able to actually laugh about something, just for that brief moment, it brings in some positivity. That positivity that they're feeling is being in that ventral vagal state. So this is not accidental that feels good, because it's actually putting you in a different mindset. Now, the next thing on the ladder is your sympathetic nervous system. This is your fight-flight response. And this one is actually still helpful. All of these things have a benefit to them. But this is the part of you that gets active when, you're almost having a car accident or someone's, trying to come at you and looks like they want to fight. This is what turns on. So that's your sympathetic nervous system. Then you have your very last stage, and that's what's referred to as your dorsal vagal system. Your dorsal vagal system is, dorsal just means bottom, and this is the very bottom part of your vagus nerve that actually taps directly into your gut. So some of you have gotten those dreaded phone calls where you hear bad news. Where do you usually feel that? It's right here, right? And that's from your vagus nerve. That's your vagus nerve, and it's because something is hit pretty deeply there. And it's not always bad when that happens, but if it hits really, really hard, it can cause us to faint. It can cause us to become overwhelmed. Sometimes it even cause people to lose control over their bodily functions. So their bowels or they can void their bladders. Things like that can happen when this part of the nerve is activated. Now, all these things are survival responses, and all of them have a specific purpose. But with polyvagal theory, what we're trying to do is help people to recognize where they're at in their vagus nerve. And what the person does in this particular approach is you try to get somebody from one stage to the next. So if somebody is all the way down in the dorsal vagal, you're not really going to be able to help them very much by just talking to them, right? Because they're totally dissociated, they're disconnected from everything that's going on around them. They feel like they're just about to collapse. When somebody's in that particular state, that's not what they need. Now, I just want you to check this. So if it goes dorsal vagal, and that's like the parasympathetic nervous system overactive and is causing them to want to pass out. And this is sympathetic nervous system fight flight. And then this is, I'm in my thinking brain. If someone's all the way down here, where do you want to try to take them? What would be the most logical place to take them next? Right, it would be to the second stage here. So sympathetic nervous system. Right. And so as strange as it seems, when I see somebody who's in that collapse state, I actually want them to get more up towards a fight flight state. Now, the way that this looks is I'm not going to scare them. That's not how I do it. But if the way that this often works is like, you can think about this with like depression. When I'm working with somebody who's depressed, one of the first emotions that I ask them about is what they're angry about. Because people who tend to be depressed are also quite angry about something. I've never met anybody who is depressed who's not simultaneously really, really angry and upset about something. And so what I do is I intentionally ask them what they're upset about, what it is that's actually making them angry. So I know that will take them out of this dorsal vagal state back up to this sympathetic state. In trauma, I do something similar because when you're down here, you feel powerless. Like my life is over, there's nothing I can do about it. Everything feels hopeless, I'm essentially dead. This is the actual part of your nervous system that gets active that causes animals to play dead. So it's not accidental that you're thinking that way because you're going into a state that animals have that allow them to play dead so that they're not killed. If it works, it's a last resort, and it can. But one of the things that I do to help somebody who's in like a traumatized state is help them to realize that they do have the ability to fight back, or they do have the ability to escape the threat. You don't have to just stand there and take the abuse. You can do something about it. And so I get them into a can-do thought mentality. I'm not trying to rationalize anything with them because that's way up here. I'm trying to get them into a can-do mentality. Now, once we've gotten into that can-do state, now I can start to get them to a state of recognizing, hey, there's support. There are better things that are out there. You can have joys again. You can be happy again. You can actually feel enjoyment and satisfaction once again. So anyway, I'd love to give more examples of this, but I know that time is not going to be my friend. And so we'll continue on just a little bit. And here's some other really practical ones. This one doesn't require so much explanation. They've actually found that when people take probiotics, of all things, probiotics do actually tend to help people with emotion regulation. And if even people have PTSD, it takes some of the edge off their symptoms if they take probiotics. Now that might sound kind of strange, but if you've learned anything about how the gut and brain work together, your gut is considered like it's considered like your second brain. Other than your brain, your gut has more neurons than any other place in your body. It actually is a highly communicative system. And when it has what it needs, that communication actually ramps up and gets better. Also, 80% of the serotonin that's oftentimes used in SSRIs for antidepressants, 80% of your serotonin comes from your gut. And so if your gut is in better health, it's almost like taking an antidepressant, except without all the side effects. And so it's a really straightforward way to actually improve. Cold water, as I mentioned before, is also helpful. When somebody is in a dysregulated state, like if they're in that total collapse state, this is actually something I've told people to do before, is to actually put their face in a bowl of ice water. And there's a good reason for that. When your face hits ice water, it actually can have both a calming and an enervating effect. On the innervating effect, it can actually cause you to get a shot of adrenaline so that you actually wake up and become more alert. But even if you're overly activated, cold water on the face can help calm you down. I know it sounds kind of paradoxical, but when your face hits cold water like ice water, what happens is you have another set of nerves in your face. It's called your trigeminal nerve, and that actually spans through your face. And as soon as it gets in contact with cold water, it activates what's called a mammalian dive reflex. So when a mammal jumps into cold water, oftentimes it's trying to either escape from something. Well, we'll just stick with that one. It's oftentimes trying to escape from something because they don't really like cold water most of the time. And as soon as that happens, the body says, hey, we've just jumped into cold water. We're going to have to hold our breath for some period of time. We need to slow down the heart rate. We need to make sure the muscles aren't overly tense, and it actually calms the body down. And it's specifically when it touches your face, not when it touches somewhere else per se. So that's really interesting. It's a super useful technique, cold water on the face. The other parts are being able to create more positive thoughts and feelings. I'll go over that one last because I think that one will take a little more time to explain, but I'd like to end on that one because it's something that we can directly experience. All right, so EMDR. This is one of the more controversial approaches to doing therapy. APA, American Psychological Association, lists this as a second tier approach to processing trauma. They have cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, and one other particular approach that they look at as first line. I have a little bit of disagreement about the prolonged exposure. I think that's probably one of the most difficult ways to heal from trauma. But nevertheless, that's how they have it listed. Now, EMDR is a specific approach that uses eye movements for bilateral stimulation to help heal from trauma. The thought process is that when you are stimulating both sides of the brain, you're having them alternate in their stimulation, that it does the same thing when you're asleep. So when you're asleep, you ever seen anybody's eyes rapidly move back and forth? Now, this is something that is happening while you're asleep because the right and left hemispheres are communicating with each other. And it's helping you to process through both your emotions and your memories. This is usually why if you've had like a really rough day and like you had an argument with somebody, you go to sleep and you feel better. It's not because the problem solved itself while you're asleep. What did happen though is that your emotions help to calm themselves down. It's also the reason why if you don't get good sleep before you take a test, you actually perform more poorly. It's because when you're asleep and that right and left processing is going on, your memories are getting consolidated. Your brain is actually making sense out of the things you learned today with the things you knew from yesterday. So the thought process is that if you do this while somebody is conscious, then you can also help them to integrate memories, because when somebody experiences trauma, it affects the right side of the brain way more than the left. And in fact, when somebody is experiencing like a flashback, when somebody experiences a flashback, the right side of their brain is very active, and it's actually the left side of the brain almost totally shuts down when somebody's experiencing a flashback. And that's because the right side of your brain is all about the present, it's all about the intense emotions, and it's all about threat detection. And when you go into those kind of states, that's the part of your brain that's the most active. So if you stimulate the left side and right side of the brain, alternatively, they believe that this is what can help to heal. Now, there's all the research on there has not fully and has not established that as being the most effective mechanism. But for the things that I think that are effective with EMDR are some of the what's called like a resource installation, like skills that people learn to help them calm their bodies. And one of those is the ability to take yourself into a spot or a space where you have a positive memory. All right, so this is one area where I would like you to try just a quick thought experiment. So if all of you have a note page, I'm going to ask you just to write down a few things. And you're not going to share this with me or anything like that. I just want you to jot this down because I want you to see how this part works here. So just find maybe not in the same place that you've been writing your notes, but just some blank space on the page. I'm just going to ask you a few questions, and then I just want you to write them down. And then just notice also how you feel when you think about these things that I'm going to ask. Okay. So my first question for you is, I want you to try to think about a place where either you've been there before or you'd like to be there, but the ideal place where you would feel the most peaceful. Right? You don't have to tell me what that is, but just write down what that place is, and just jot this down. All right. Now, after you have that jotted down, the next thing I want you to do is I want you to think about what it would be like to be there. But I don't want you just to like talk about it in some generic way. For this one, we're just at the bullet point because we don't have time to do this really thoroughly. I want you to write down at least 5 things that you would see if you were there. Like, I might see the sun coming up. it's the ocean, I might see the waters kind of lapping at the shore. I might see seagulls, I like the ocean. But just 5 things that you might see. Try to picture them in as much detail as possible, but just jot them down for this point. Give me just a moment to do that. So next thing I want you to be able to do is I want you to think about at least 4 things that you would be able to feel. Like if you were really standing there, if it's the beach, like it would be for me, I can feel sand under my feet. I'd be able to feel the warmth of the sun on my face. I'd be able to feel the breeze. But think about 4 things that you know you would feel in this very peaceful place. 4 things that you would feel. Just bullet points, so you don't have to, you can think in detail, but just write briefly. Okay. The next part here, I want you to think about 3 things that you'd be able to hear. What would be some of the sounds? So for me, I hear the ocean, I hear the waves lapping, I might hear seagulls, but what would be 3 things that you'd be able to hear? So you can think in detail, but just write briefly. All right. Now, for this last couple of things, I want you to jot down 2 things that you would be able to smell. If it's the forest, maybe you smell pine, maybe you smell something that's in the air, but what would be 2 things that you could smell in that peaceful place that you're thinking? So write briefly, but imagine more in detail, like how that would really feel to smell it. And for the last one, this one may be difficult. If you don't have anything, it's okay. But what might be one thing that you can taste? Maybe it's the taste of the air, maybe it's somewhere where you're eating something, doesn't matter. But what's at least one thing that you would be able to taste? So picture in detail, but write briefly. Now, whether you wrote something down or you just thought about it, how did that feel to think about all those details of this place that makes you feel peaceful? Does anybody feel a little more calm and relaxed? Anybody wish you were somewhere other than sitting right here right now? Now, this is what's really profound about this. There's a part of your brain that's called your thalamus. Your thalamus is the part of your brain that takes all your sensory information and collects it all together and allows you to have an experience of the outside world. What's really profound is that when you are imagining something deeply or when you are dreaming, your thalamus can't tell the difference between what you imagine and what you experience. Now, the reason that's so important when we're talking about like trauma is you already know this is true with negative memories. If I told you all to think about a time when you felt really embarrassed or really upset or angry, you know that you can make that feel very real. But we don't spend a lot of time trying to make positive experiences very real, partly because they're not as easily accessible as negative ones. But the other reason is that we don't take it in detail. And this is one of the things that I try to teach people how to do is to intentionally pick either a memory or an experience or a place where they can take this in as much detail as possible. Because the very moment they do that, their body will respond like they're there. So instead of being hijacked by a traumatic memory, you can actually be what's called LoJack, but you can be taken more captive by a positive memory. Now, even in my own experience, we are encouraged to be thinking about things like heaven and imagining it in detail, like let the imagination really grasp. Or even when you're reading something, for me, you know, I often read scripture, but other people read other things. But I try to picture things in as much detail as possible, because the more there I am, the more I start to actually change in the present. And so using the imagination in an intentional way to actually help to overcome traumas is one of the things that that I believe that EMDR gets right, and you don't have to do EMDR to get that. You can do that anywhere, anytime. All right. So there's a lot more there. So we're gonna jump now over to not the EMDR. I'm gonna skip all those details because while they're interesting, we don't have enough time to go through them. All right. So written exposure therapy. It's gonna be really brief on this
Sorry.
one. Yes.
Did you say what EMDR stands for?
Yes, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a mouthful, but
And that's what we just did.
no, we took one of the components that's used in EMDR, which is using resourcing. It's like using a peaceful place, but being intentional about imagining that in as much detail as possible. The reason we do that with people is because if you're going to talk to somebody about their traumas, you want to first give them the ability to regulate their emotions. Because you don't want to take somebody, we don't want to put somebody on the trauma train unless you give them the ability to get off of it. Because that's really dangerous to do that. It can really be activating and dysregulating for people.
What was the R again?
Reprocessing.
Thank you.
So written exposure therapy, this one's a lot more straightforward. It's not one that I've used. I do supervise some people who have used this technique before. There's reasons why I'm not super excited about it, but it's not because it's a bad thing. So written exposure therapy, as you can see here on the slide, this allows a client to articulate their traumatic memories and it facilitates emotional expression and processing. So the person actually just writes out their story. And it's actually kind of an exposure technique because they keep writing out the story until it has less and less and less power over them, because it's like, if they tell the story enough and they write it out enough, then eventually they learn how to be in the presence of that story without becoming dysregulated. Now, they also add some other strategies too, is like as I write out the story, just like we were talking about, if you're in the cold water, they learn how to breathe, they learn how to regulate themselves in the presence of their negative story. And over time, the brain actually starts to learn that I can tell this story without being terrified, overwhelmed. So it's a slow process. It's gradual, but it does eventually work. It's just tough because if you're starting out at like a level 12, that's very hard to sit through that for like a few weeks and then only get down to an 11. But it is a gradual process and people do tend to improve over time. So that's written exposure therapy. If people have questions about that, just let me know and I'll get a little bit more into it. So you have structured writing assignments. There's a confronting of the trauma. Through the writing, the clients confront the trauma, which is essential for them processing emotions and promoting healing. So they're not trying to avoid it anymore. They're actually going to go after this thing head on. And that's why the writing part can also be really helpful. The other reason why writing is helpful is because writing makes you focus. You can't jump all over the place with your pen. You can only write one thing at a time. And so once you do that, you're actually focusing your ability to narrate a story. The other piece is, you all remember what part of the brain trauma really hijacks? Right or left? Do you remember? It's the right side of the brain. Now, guess what side of your brain you use for writing?
Right.
Is the left side of the brain. Use your right hand, but like your left side of your brain is that does the talking and the writing. And so when you're writing out your trauma, you're purposely making your left hemisphere get involved with this process of the trauma itself, which can actually be very helpful and may even be one of the mechanisms that helps people to process their traumas. All right.
And typing is different than writing.
Yes, actually. So this is a fun fact. When people handwrite like their notes for the class, they retain the information better than when they type it. And when they type it, they retain it better than when they just listen. And so whenever you take notes, you automatically improve how much information you're able to keep from it. But when you write it by hand, it has an even larger effect. So the handwriting of it is actually one of the things that helps to work more quickly. Now, some people just can't and they have to type, so it's not like it doesn't work for them, but handwriting makes a tremendous difference. In fact, with some of the classes I teach, I try to encourage my students to handwrite their stuff because they're more likely to remember it when they actually go through the process of moving their hands while they take notes. All right, internal family systems. This is probably one of my preferred approaches, but all of these have exceptions. I mean, there's some parts of internal family systems I'm not as excited about, but internal family systems is basically looking at how psychologically we have parts to ourselves. Now, if you don't think you have parts to yourself, I can demonstrate that you do with a simple question. Have you ever done anything that you either didn't mean to do, wish you hadn't done, or were surprised that you did? All right. If the answer to any one of those three is yes, that means there's a part of yourself that kind of jumped behind the steering wheel and you weren't prepared to deal with it. we have different parts to ourselves that are active all the time. And internal family systems, what it does is it looks at how,
Family.
yeah, so there's a reason for the family piece. So the reason that internal family systems takes this particular approach is there are character traits to some of these parts of ourselves. So, and this is not a new idea, Freud kind of talked about this, but he got into some weird places with it. But the way that I break down internal family systems for people is you have several details. One is you have your security system, right? So my security system, that's like my fight or flight part, does not think the same way that my managing part, the part that does the homework. And you probably know this too. Like when you're really angry, you're not thinking very intellectually, right? There's a whole different part of yourself that gets online when that happens. So you have one part that's called like your that they call your firefighters. This is kind of the part that's your protector. Firefighters will show up in a variety of ways in people's lives. And just like the title implies, this firefighter part of yourself will do whatever it takes to put out a fire. Now, you probably haven't thought about the fact that firefighters are really destructive. But, if your house is on fire, what do? They kick down the door, they use axes, they hose your house down. Like, and these hoses are super high pressure. No one has ever had a fire where a firefighter came in and the house looked better than it did. Well, I can't say that. Unless my house was really a mess. Like most of the time, when the firefighter comes in, after they've been there, you can kind of tell. Now, even though their presence is destructive, it's better than the house burning down, right? And I want you to think about this part of yourself as being the same. It does whatever it takes to put out the fire. And when I've worked with people, their firefighters have done things like sometimes get them on drugs. Because like if they drink alcohol, then at least they don't, start breaking things. At least if they drink, then they don't attempt suicide, because sometimes that's the only thing that keeps them from doing it. And so it's not a helpful pattern, like in long term, but in the short term, the firefighter gets the job done. All right. And if you think about this, you do have a part of yourself that knows how to get the job done. Like how many of you, if your house was on fire, would try to make sure you save yourself and your kids before you go in there and try to make sure the furniture doesn't get destroyed, right? Furniture is important. That's why you pay money for it, but it's not as important as those critical pieces in your life. But when somebody's firefighter is active all the time, then they're constantly making emergency decisions instead of making long-term decisions, right? And so internal family systems, what we try to do is we try to figure out what parts are overactive and which parts need to be more active, which parts are underactive. So firefighter is one part. The other part is what's called a manager. This is the part that likes to work a lot. And some people use their managers to escape their pain too. If I work 16 hours a day, then I never have time to sit around and think about the things that are really bothering me. I'm always taking on projects. Every time somebody asks me for a favor, I say yes. And I'm so busy that I never have time to stop and process the things that are going on in my own life. Right? So that's the manager part. Then you have what are referred to as the exiles, and they're exactly what they sound like. Oftentimes, this is that child part of self. This is the part of self that we try to keep hidden from everyone else. It's the part that feels a lot of these vulnerable emotions like sadness and helplessness and all these other pieces. But here's the trick. Even though that part of self, the exile, carries these really difficult negative emotions, it's also the exact same part that carries the really big positive emotions. It's also the part that it can feel extreme joy. It's the part that enjoys throwing rocks in the river. And what happens is people try so hard to shut down that part that has those really bad emotions that they don't realize that they're also shutting down the good experiences with it. Right? So if you actually put a kid in the closet because they're throwing a fit, you will get rid of the fit, but you'll also get rid of all the good things that child brings into your life too. And so internal family systems, what it does is it brings all these different parts into the room again. And so that the person can actually use all of these parts of self so they're all actually communicating with each other instead of fighting with each other, instead of distrusting each other. Now, I'm not teaching people to be schizophrenic, but if you recognize that your protective part, your managing part, and your childlike part can actually all coexist like a family does, then people actually tend to get better. And far and away, this is probably one of the strategies that I've seen cause the most healing for people. Because once they get fully integrated again, they're no longer ashamed of these other parts of self that take over so often. So if you have questions about that, please jot them down. I'm looking at my time and we're almost at an hour already, so I have to keep moving. All right. Dialectical behavioral therapy. This is DBT. Dialectical behavioral therapy is actually what's considered third-rate cognitive behavioral therapy. So it still focuses on cognition, but has a lot of focus on emotion regulation. DBT is the go-to for people with bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder, or really any other cluster B ones, people who are very reactive, who are very upset, or like very dramatic. You may know people like this. You might be this person sometimes. But people who really struggle with this particular presentation, DBT is a therapy approach that really works for them. In fact, that whole cold water in the face is one of the skills that you use. Now, rather than get into the whole nuts and bolts of DBT, I want to give you 4 really fast tips that you can use from DBT. All right. So the acronym is going to be TIP, T-I-P-P. All right. So you might just want to write that down because it's not going to be on any slides. So this is TIP. This is one of many, many acronyms that are involved with DBT. You can probably also call this alphabet therapy because it has more acronyms than any other treatment approach I've ever seen before. It's an entire book of acronyms that teach you interpersonal skills, how to do chain analysis, how to trace things from cause to effect. It is extremely meticulous, but very helpful when people lack the structure in their own lives to regulate themselves. So tip skill. So T is temperature. All right. So we kind of touched on this one a little bit already. So temperature, this is like the cold water to the face. You can actually use temperature as a way to regulate your nervous system. Another one is like squeezing ice cubes. Temperature really arrests our attention and brings us back into the present. That present mindful awareness piece really does come in when you use temperature. So use temperature changes to do that. Hydrotherapy is also another way to be able to do this too. And hydrotherapy has some healing properties, not just because it helps with circulation in the body, but again, when you use alternating temperatures, it can help to regulate your emotions as well. All right, so then the I. I is intense exercise. Exercise far and away is, especially for like depression, they've done trials where they've compared exercise to medication and medication plus therapy. At the end of like 6 months to a year, the exercise people just demolish everyone else who's just only doing medications and therapy. Exercise is just incredible. Exercise, one of the things that it does for the brain is it helps to increase the presence of what's called BDNF. You don't have to know what that, write down what that means, but it's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is considered the fertilizer for your neurons. And it's something that it's connected with serotonin and all kinds of things. But when you have more of this brain fertilizer, your neurons grow more. If your neurons grow more, then you learn faster, more efficiently, and more, and for a longer period of time. You have more long-term connections that can happen in the brain. And so BDNF comes from that. Now, and the reason why it has to be intense in an emotion regulation situation, like I've actually had people say, look, when you start to feel that way, drop down and start doing as many push-ups as you can, which, you know, almost kind of sounds like a dad who's trying to tell you not to feel your feelings, but that's not really what this is about. When you do intense exercise, it actually takes the adrenaline that's coming from your nervous system and puts it somewhere so you're not carrying all that stress and adrenaline with you. So I don't encourage like doing something that's violent to let out all that energy, but something that is like intense exercise. So jumping jacks, push-ups, running, but not just running, like sprinting as fast as you can. So like this is intentional. If you have heart conditions, please don't do something that's going to cause harm, but you want to do something that's intense. If you have joint problems, another one that you can do is you can take your palms like this and cross them over and then push your hands together as hard as you can. You actually feel that in your chest. It's actually a way to do chest workout if you aren't able to do push-ups, but pressing your hands together really hard and doing that, but the exercise has to be intense. So that's I. All right, the first P is paced breathing. All right, so we talked about the breathing, the 6, 7, 8 breathing, but a quicker strategy to be able to use is what's referred to as 4, 4, 6 breathing. So again, it's that same idea. You breathe in for 4, you hold for 4, you exhale for 6. This is 4, 4, 6 breathing. So that's paced breathing. And the very last one is paired muscle relaxation. So for this one, what you do is you take a muscle group and you hold it for about as tight as you can for 10 seconds, as tight as you can, as long as it does not cause injury. And you hold it as tight as you can, and then you allow it to relax as much as possible. And what you do is you pair your muscle groups. You can start from the ground up, like work through the muscles in your feet, your legs, get into your stomach, your glutes, or whatever. What you do is you tense as hard as you can, and then you relax. Now, these kind of skills can help with immediate emotion regulation. These are not long-term strategies, but there are ones that can help you to take some of the edge off in a given moment. All right. All right. So cognitive processing therapy, this will be one of the last two that we look at here. Cognitive processing therapy is very similar to written exposure therapy. And this one is a highly structured process where the person not only identifies and tells their story, but what they do is they specifically look for the unhelpful beliefs in their story. So that's very tiny. But what it does is it helps the person look at what are the unhelpful things you're telling yourself in the story. So I work with a veteran whose biggest trauma wasn't just the gory things that she saw, but it was really the fact that she didn't feel like she acted as she should have. So when she looked back at these experiences where there was, like there was an explosion and she didn't, and she felt like she could have prevented it. Every time she looks back, she thinks about like how weak she was and how, if she was just stronger and had better reflexes and just reacted fast enough, then she could have stopped it from happening. So she was carrying lots of guilt about that. And so we started to do is we looked at like, okay, is that belief necessary? Like when you were back there, were you sitting there thinking, yeah, I'm just going to stand here right now because I want this person to get blown up? Is that what you were thinking? And of course, the answer was no. Second thing was, did you want to be able to get out there and do it? And obviously the answer to that was yes. And then the third thing was, well, what actually happened? Because it wasn't like you just deciding to be weak or lacking more courage. What happened? Well, my body froze. Now, why did your body freeze? Was it because you were being weak or was there something else going on? And so what we do is we look at those unhelpful beliefs and we try to explore what's the real story behind why you get these things. All right. So that's cognitive processing a little bit in a nutshell. These sessions are at least an hour and a half. They sometimes will do these twice a week. It's very, very intense. But again, the recovery on there seems to be pretty high. All these trauma treatments, by the way, that I'm talking about, all of them perform almost the same, but they don't all use the same process. Sometimes up to 2 times a week that they'll do this. It's very, very intense. It's very structured. Like every session has a plan. Like session 1 has a protocol, session 2 has a protocol. All of it is very, very structured. And for some people, that's really helpful because trauma is anything but structured most of the time. And so having that structure can be very helpful to people. Now, similar to what I said last time, whenever we're dealing with traumas, the big thing I want everybody to be able to take away from this is that in every spot where life has been broken, only the most precious materials would do to put it back together. But because the precious materials are what are necessary to bring them back together, the end result of it can be something that was more beautiful than what we started. And there is no reason why trauma has to be the end of our story or the defining of our story. But it can actually be the beginning of a better story that we create from the broken fragments and pieces that we've been left with. So with that, I'll stop for today and make sure that I leave space for any questions on this last presentation. Some microphones, just in case anybody has any questions. Certainly, if anybody has questions on the Zoom, I guess if those show up in the chat, then we can try to take a look at those. But we want to make sure that if there are any questions, we can have those. All I say for this last one, since I'll try to keep it open as long as I can. If you keep your questions kind of a little bit short, just so there's enough time for everybody to get their questions in, that would be awesome. All right. So up front here first.
You had said that the written exposure therapy, that if anybody wants to find more about that, you would be more than glad to talk.
Yes. So for written exposure therapy, so I think one of the ways that this particular approach can be very helpful is because the person's writing it, they don't actually have to talk about it out loud. And believe it or not, that actually can be something that's very helpful to the person because they actually can look at what their words say and they can actually record these in a more meaningful way. But what I would say is like, if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details, there's a few authors who have written about this, but if you do a search on written exposure therapy, it does get into a lot more detail about it. Again, it's not one that I've actually been trained in. I've been trained in some of these other ones, but that's one I don't have as much training in. But that's the basic concept behind it, is that if we can write these things out, then we can kind of make these things concrete. Some people have even found it beneficial after they've written these things out to have a kind of cathartic moment where they burn the script, they burn the narrative as a way of actually letting go. And so it can, by putting it into this physical form, it also has a tendency to allow the person to kind of externalize the story and make it something that's not just living inside of them, but now can actually be something on the outside that they'll always have as a memory, but it's not something that's guiding their lives.
Well, I think too that it means that, I can go home tonight and do that. I don't have to make an appointment with a counselor.
Yeah, yes, you can. But the only caveat I say to that is just be mindful of if something starts to become too intense. Know when it's time to kind of step back from it, because you don't want to overwhelm the system. Sometimes we can even experience kind of getting re-traumatized if we jump into something too fast. Right. So give yourself a little bit of space, but yeah, there's something that somebody can start to do. But there's more specific structures to it that that I didn't put up there. So I would say definitely look into more of the details before doing it. But yeah, it is something that can be done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Very helpful. Thanks.
I just wanted to say about, I think you mentioned way early on about the not the two breaths, the double breath, which is, well, what I thought it was is like, oh, I think I know what that is, because like after you cry, like
Yes.
intensely,
Mhm.
there's sort of like it's sort of like
It's
that
exactly that. Yes.
two thing, and I experienced that. I'm like, I recognize what you're talking about, and then you start to calm down, but it's like that, you know, everything's intense, loud crying, and then I've heard that so
Yes.
many times, done that myself.
Yeah, it's totally instinctive. And you know, if anybody's taking care of infants before they do that too, they do that like you know, they kind of do anyway. That's our aspect. Anyway, yes. So that kind of breathing, it actually signals to your nervous system that it's time to start tapering down. It's time to start closing that down. These are very instinctive. Yes.
So I have another question with that written
Yes.
example.
Mhm.
I have the grandkids, right? So could they dictate to me and I write it for them? Would that help as well?
That's a really good question. I like my straightforward answer is I'm not 100% sure. But I mean, just them telling the story can really be helpful. Actually, one detail that I can probably connect both of these questions with is that one of the other critical pieces is that the story has a beginning, middle, and end to it. A lot of times trauma feels like it's just this happened and that was like the end of everything, or just like it's almost like the story has like this continuous nature, like it never ends, it's constantly spilling into everything. But part of what exposure therapy does is it actually provides a story with a beginning. Like I came into the situation, this was really terrible for me. I survived though, I got out, and it was over. Like it's really important to be able to capture that the story has a beginning, middle, and ending to it, especially that it had an ending to it. And again, by repeating those things and actually writing those things out, it can really be therapeutic. So yes.
When we were talking about, you know, the genetics, it occurred to me while listening to the rest of it, that, I mean, since my grandparents raised me, they're more of the philosophy from like the 30s, 40s, 50s. And in the 50s, women were not outspoken.
Right.
Well, I'm obviously the total opposite of that. But the funny thing that occurred to me is nowadays fights are more verbal, but with my grandparents, because they were married 68 years, she would give them the silent treatment and it drove them nuts.
Yeah.
He would try everything. Well, I wouldn't even attempt that. He does it sometimes. So go and isolate. But I think that comes from our trauma, actually, in our lives. Because you tend to isolate. You know, you don't want to go in socialization like with the PTSD.
Yeah, it's a protective action. Most of the time people do that because that's how they soothe themselves. So this kind of goes a little bit into attachment. I'll just say this really briefly. If somebody tends to be a little more on the anxious attachment style, when they're dysregulated, they look to connect with people to calm down. Like, I need you to talk me down. There's some people who, when they're really dysregulated, they want everybody to get away because I just need to have some space so I can calm myself down. But both of them are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to calm themselves down. And if you have different styles, those two, most of the time what will happen is the person who likes to talk finds someone who doesn't, and then they just drive each other crazy. But like, there's a way to work that out. I mean, because like, you know, me and my wife, we've dealt with that before. I mean, like, it's very, very normal, and it's very. There is a way to talk through these things and figure out how do you find that common ground. So yeah, it's not. Yeah, there's not something like deeply wrong with somebody. It's not somebody else's fault, but it is a way of trying to regulate itself. We have two.
I'm just interested to know, how do you not do that? How do you not get together with people who drive you crazy?
So you've heard the saying that opposites attract.
Right.
Right. Well, the reason that happens is it's the same reason why. Okay, so if you think about this like in a complementary fashion, um, if one of my biggest issues is that I have a lot of difficulty, like I'll use something really generic, like managing my finances. That's something I have a really hard time with. But I don't have a hard time working really hard. I'm probably not going to be as attracted to somebody who works really hard because I've already got that taken care of. I'm going to be attracted to somebody who can take care of the things that I don't take care of very well. And if you don't want to find yourself just looking for somebody who's the opposite of you, what you do is you actually get good at that thing that you're not good at. And as you get good at that, especially on an emotional level, what starts to happen is you get more of a balance. And so you start looking for people who have both qualities existing at the same time. Right. But if that's who we find, that's who we find. So if you found that, what you need to do is just grow together. I mean, that's not just grow together, but that is the solution there, is to grow together. You start to strengthen the things that you struggle with. So if you're the person that doesn't talk as much, you learn how to start talking more. If the person who depends on talking too much, then you learn how to calm yourself down. And as you do that, you actually grow together.
Okay, so that would then lend to willingness
Mhm.
of people to grow.
Yes.
So what you want to find then is someone willing to grow.
Yes.
How do you know that?
Well, there's all kinds of telltale signs that you'll see, and a lot of times you'll see some of these signals early on. Probably the first sign, especially if you're courting somebody, is just watch how you deal with your first conflict. Because however you deal with your first conflict, that's probably how all the rest of them are going to go too. So but conflict is natural. Conflict is not wrong. It's just the result of being different.
Yes, I have two comments here. One has to do with, you said go to the ideal place.
Mhm.
The other one has to do with where do we go from here? Do you continue as a church doing seminars like this quarterly, where we get to know these topics better, we become experts on it, we find books that we can read about it, we find training, and then we, or do we, us desperados, go to counseling, and how much do we pay for that? Now, my first question had to do with the ideal place. I found myself going to a place in my life where I knew kind of where everything was and what everybody was doing.
Mhm.
And it was my parents' house. They had the same house for over 50 years, and my dad always sat in the same chair, read the same San Francisco Chronicle, and walked out the door at the same time from, his sleeping quarters to go and prepare his breakfast and all like that. But I also felt that going back, looking at this, I said there are things that weren't resolved.
Yeah.
So that is my question.
Yes.
How is it that ideal place reflected like, I want to go and resolve that? Now, of course, in dreams, we're trying to do that.
Right. Okay. So for that question, so whenever I do this with people, I always say make sure the place does not have what I refer to as contamination, right? And so contamination does not mean that it's like bad, but what it does mean is that there can be a conflicting emotion there. Like somebody might say, "Oh, I really love being at my grandma's house," but then at the same time, if they have unresolved grief, like I still feel like I never got to say what I need to say to my grandma, that would not be a good place to use yet, because there's still something unresolved. But what I would take from what you said, if I was just using your example here, is that that tells me that you probably get a lot of peace from routine and regularity, right? And so then what I would say is I might even try to structure a place that has that, but doesn't have the unresolved pieces involved with it. And so you can borrow that, and you can construct that any way that you need to. And so that would be what I would want to do, especially when I'm dealing with trauma, because the place that you choose has to be a place that that only brings peace with it, and not all the other stuff. And so it becomes a little bit of a dance in how you do that.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very nurturing, just that comment. Thank you.
Yeah. So then, and your other one is, where does the church go from here? So if as a church, you're trying to help people who have been through this before, you usually just want to target one thing that you can do really well, right? You don't want to try to become a place where you provide all aspects of therapy for people. So maybe your church deals with some of just the physiological pieces. Maybe we deal with the nutrition aspects and hey, this can help you in this area. Or if it's on the spiritual nurturing side, look, we really put an emphasis on this aspect of how you heal from trauma. But trying to provide everything all at once would be really, really difficult and require a tremendous amount of training. But then as an individual, I think it could be helpful you can always try the self-help approach too, first, because all of these things that I'm talking about, there are books you can read through and practice and do these things for yourself. Just having professional assistance can sometimes be helpful. Like if you cut your finger, you can probably bandage that up and maybe even do your own stitches, but you can't do open heart surgery on yourself. I don't recommend that. It's really difficult to keep the bleeding under control. And so some things do require an outside hand, but if some things can be done on a personal level, then I would say start there because everything doesn't have to be managed by a therapist, but some things can definitely be more beneficial when you do. All right, other questions?
So I have one. Maybe you could elaborate on parameters in reconnecting with someone who's a source of trauma. Say it was a parent or grandparents. When is it safe or healthy for people to reach out? And if they do, how would you advise people to do that?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with the unfortunate truth. Sometimes it never is with that person. Because there's been some situations where if you ever try to go back to that person, you can be killed. And I'm not saying that as like tongue in cheek, or just like being speaking hyperbole, but there really are situations where sometimes you can. In those kind of cases, what I would do, what I encourage clients to do is to actually just walk through the scenario in your head. So this is kind of a real thing that we've all been designed with the ability to do. Sometimes you can get a release around something by just imagining it rather than actually doing it. This is so profound that whenever they've had people, just like they had people like do finger exercises where they would just kind of like squeeze down on something and it provided some resistance, right, to do finger exercises. They had one group practice the finger exercises and they had another group imagine practicing the finger exercises just only in their head. And after like the first 2 weeks, there was no difference between the two. Both of them improved in their strength, both the imaginary group and the actual group. Now, once you get to 4 or 5 weeks, the actual group starts to gain strength that's not possible just to imagine in a way too. But there are some things you can actually play out in your head and get the same benefits from. Now, on the second side of it, if a conversation is possible, how can you determine whether or not that's the case? So I have a case right now where there's a person who's trying to reach out to their mom, where they've had some really difficult conflicts. And what you do is like, the first thing I tell people to do is to write out what it is you really want to say. If you're not clear on what you want to say, then you can find yourself kind of wandering around and like having conversations that take a really long time. You want to know what it is you want to say before you go into that. So I have them write down what it is that they really want to say. The second thing I do is I have them figure out what will be the ideal response from that person. Third thing I have them do is how are you going to respond if you don't get the ideal response from that person? Right? And sometimes just by people writing that out, they decide that they don't need to have the conversation at all. But for some people, they still want to hear it, even if it's not what they actually want to hear. But once they process through that, if you reach out to the person, you find out if they're interested in having a conversation, and you're prepared for the fact that they may not be ready to as well. So that's just a short answer, but yeah.
I just wanted to ask, like, why, with bipolar and other illnesses like that, why don't they involve the rest of the family? Because it impacts everybody, and it's like, we could be a source of support if we knew how to support and what were good things to do and what are like, don't do this, kind of thing. I just wish that there was more of the family involved.
So is it a question of more why doesn't the family get involved, or why doesn't the person who has the illness try to get more people involved?
No, why doesn't therapy include that?
Okay, yeah. So there might be a couple of reasons. One is that the therapist may not be trained to do it because not every therapist is like a family therapist. Most therapists do individual kind of counseling. The second thing is it may not always be possible, like because the client themselves may not want the family to be involved with the therapy. But I think more often than not, it's usually because either the therapist or the client, somebody is uncomfortable with trying to bring that in and still trying to negotiate those boundaries. Because the more people you bring into the room, the more complicated the therapy becomes. It actually is way harder to do therapy with more people in the room than just having one person in front of you. But it would be more ideal if you could bring the family in. And I've certainly done that with clients before, but it's tough work and not everybody is trained to do it. And so sometimes they're better off trying to help the individual, but yeah, ideally it would be better to get more people involved. So yeah, it's a big challenge. Yes.
I just wanted to talk of the experience of a divine appointment. As to say, I haven't seen so-and-so for so long, not sure our relationship is really good, might be a family member. Lord, I just want you to make a divine appointment. I don't know the right timing, I don't know the thing to say, but I know that God can do it. You know, I'm not gonna say it works every time, because I don't do it every time. I do know that God gives us that chance to see His miracle working power to enliven our hearts to know that He's with us in the details. And I love this talking therapy here because we don't even know how to address the things that have happened to us. So the fact that we can, you know, ask for divine guidance and that that's there. And I think that it's the most powerful thing on our hearts is what God can do for us rather than what we can do for ourselves. And so I wanted to just express that in such a clear way. Thank you.
Other questions before?
Yeah, just one other thing, you know, Kevin, is there anything wrong with to bring something out of somebody from somebody you just met that you like to, because I know I've had people get me pretty well upset just to get it, just to get it out. A lot of people hold it, I did it for a lot of years, 10 years.
Right. Yeah.
So, I guess that's the question.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
the to the brashness.
Yeah. I mean,
I know this is a house of God, here you have to be polite, but out there, politeness doesn't always work.
Yeah.
You mentioned, to a troubled mind, a troubled soul. You mentioned God right away, they're going, oh no. I'm not against God, don't get me wrong on that. But sometimes, the wake up call, the brashness, let me get Paul here really upset so he spills his guts right to find out what the problem is.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. So the way I kind of picture this is there's two ways to kind of get to the heart, right? And I'm just using this as just for illustrative purposes only. Sometimes you can break the glass, you get to the heart really, really quick. Other times you open the door. But sometimes the door is like locked, jammed, has been really closed up. I think that's kind of the case you're talking about. People are so wrapped up that it seems like it's almost impossible to get in there. And like certainly there is something to say about being provocative. I've used evocative statements to get somebody to say something. They're never insults, so it's not that kind of evocative statement. But one evocative question I asked for somebody when they let's just say somebody says, I try so hard, I really want to stop drinking. An evocative statement I made before is something like, what if you actually don't want to stop drinking? Like, are you sure you actually want to stop drinking? Now that can sound like really challenging, but it's also, it does two things. It's confrontational, but it's also getting the person to think. Like, I want you just to argue for a second about why you don't want to stop drinking. And sometimes I've seen people get more traction out of that than trying to lecture them on all the reasons why they should stop, because they already know all the reasons to stop. What they actually haven't sat and thought about is why they actually do it. And when I listen to them talk about those reasons, every single thing that they list, these are the things we actually need to work on. So you can be evocative, but a lot of times the way that you do it is you come alongside the person, because sometimes by resisting somebody, you're actually giving them something to keep fighting for. But if you actually go with the direction of them, you let them it's almost lets them fall on their face, then they actually see what they're doing to themselves. And so that actually ends up being one of the most evocative ways to get somebody to move. So it's just another approach, but yes, there are times where evocation is the better way to kind of get somebody talking about something. Yeah, there you go. So Paul, you have a job yet waiting for you then, so, yes, all right. All right, okay, I think that's probably it for questions for for this afternoon. So if there are any additional questions, that you
There's
have.
room downstairs.
Oh, in this room downstairs, and if you have any other questions, just feel free to find the contact information back there. But again, thank you all for your time and attention.
Okay, let's-